Right now, somewhere above your head, on a wire, a rooftop, a bare branch outside your window, there's a crow watching you. It has seen you before. It remembers the shape of your walk, the time you leave for work, whether you threw a rock at it 3 winters ago or dropped half a sandwich near the curb. For the entire history of our species living beside this bird, we assumed we knew what was happening inside that small black skull. We assumed there was very little happening at all. Instinct, reflex, a brain wired for survival and nothing more. That assumption just collapsed. Scientists have used artificial intelligence to eavesdrop on crows in a way no human ear has ever managed, capturing more than 127,000 individual vocalizations. And buried inside that mountain of sound is something that should not be there if crows are the simple creatures we always believed them to be. Something that looks uncomfortably like language. Once you understand what researchers actually found, you will not look at a crow on a wire the same way again. Here is why this matters so much, and why you need the full picture before we get to the discovery itself. Crows are not ordinary birds pecking at scattered seed, flying south when it gets cold, running on some simple biological script and nothing else. Crows solve multi-step puzzles that stump animals many times their size. They manufacture tools rather than simply picking up whatever is lying around, bending wire into hooks, selecting a stick of precisely the right length for a task they have not yet started. They plan for a future they cannot see yet. A crow will hide food, and if it notices another crow watching, it will wait, then quietly return later to move that food to a new hiding place the observer does not know about. Stop and sit with that, because it is not small. It means the crow understands that another mind can hold information it does not want that mind to have, and adjusts its own behavior to manage that. For decades, this ability, called theory of mind, was treated as one of the defining markers of advanced cognition, reserved for ourselves and, in limited form, our closest primate relatives. Crows were never supposed to be on that list. Then there's the matter of faces, and this is where the story gets genuinely unsettling. Crows recognize individual human faces and hold on to that recognition for years. Researchers at the University of Washington documented something in Seattle still cited as one of the eeriest findings in animal behavior. A scientist wore a specific, distinctive mask while trapping and banding wild crows, an experience the crows clearly did not enjoy. Years later, crows would still dive at and scream warnings about anyone wearing that same mask. Impressive, but not shocking yet. Here is the part that should unsettle you. Crows who had never personally been trapped, born after the original banding to entirely different parents, would also scream and dive at the mask. The fear had been taught, passed from parent to offspring, and sideways to neighboring crows who simply observed the reaction and adopted it. That is not instinct. That is culture. In the exact technical sense, scientists use the word for humans. Information transmitted across generations through teaching rather than genetics. A tradition of fear, inherited like a family recipe, just wearing feathers instead of skin. So for years, researchers had this uncomfortable pile of evidence. Tool use, planning, memory that spans years, theory of mind, culture, everything you would expect from a species with a rich internal life and a need to communicate it. And yet, the actual communication, the sounds crows were making to coordinate all of this, remained almost a complete mystery. We had the intelligence in plain view and no way to hear the conversation supposedly running underneath it. That silence is exactly what has now been broken, and the way it happened should genuinely alarm you, because it reveals how much we have been missing, not only about crows, but potentially about the volume of communication happening around us that we simply lack the tools to detect. The research comes out of northern Spain, where a population of carrion crows has been watched with decades-long patience by behavioral ecologist Daniela Canestrari and her collaborator Vittorio Baglioni at the University of Lyon. This population does something unusual even by the elevated standard of crow behavior. Most European crows pair off and raise a single brood alone. This population practices cooperative breeding instead. Extended families, parents, older siblings, sometimes more distant relatives folded into the group all work together to raise each new generation. And this is not loose cooperation. It is organized. Individual birds take specific roles. One stands guard while another forages. Guard duty rotates on a schedule. Feeding gets coordinated between multiple adults. The group makes collective decisions about when to confront a predator and when to retreat, how to balance chick care against individual survival across a season stretching for months. Sophisticated social organization simply does not run on instinct alone. It requires communication. Canestrari had believed that for years. The problem was nobody had figured out how to actually listen to it. Here's the technical wall that stopped researchers for decades, and it explains why this breakthrough could not have happened even 5 years ago. Traditional wildlife recording works from a distance, a microphone near a nest, capturing whatever is loud enough to travel through open air. For crows, that has always meant one thing: the loud, carrying, unmistakable caw, the sound that has echoed through folklore and horror films for centuries. But Canestrari suspected the real substance of crow social life. The actual coordination between family members was occurring somewhere much quieter and closer than any distant microphone could capture. In the tight acoustic space between two birds who already trust each other, working through the immediate logistics of raising chicks together, the important sounds were never built to travel far. They were built for intimacy, not distance. A microphone positioned even a short way off would miss them entirely. To hear what actually mattered, researchers needed to get inside the conversation itself. That is exactly the problem the Earth Species Project was built to solve. A nonprofit occupying a strange space between an AI research lab and a conservation group, chasing one of the most ambitious goals in modern science, using artificial intelligence to decode how non-human animals actually communicate. Their engineering team, led by Grok AI research director Olivier Piekin, built a neural network named Voxaboxin. The technology underneath that lighthearted name is genuinely serious. It was adapted from object detection systems, originally built for computer vision, the same category of algorithm used to draw boxes around cars or faces in a photograph. Instead of finding objects in an image, Voxaboxin finds vocalizations in audio, marking the precise start and end of every distinct sound. And critically, unlike older tools that blurred overlapping calls into an indistinguishable mess, it can separate individual vocalizations even when several happen at once. Picture an entire crow family clustered around a nest, adults calling, chicks begging, neighboring crows challenging the boundary. That audio is a dense tangle that has historically defeated human researchers. Voxaboxin cuts through exactly that kind of chaos at a scale no human team could match. The hardware attached to the birds was just as important. These were not bulky transmitters that might change behavior or put welfare at risk. They were miniaturized, multi-channel data loggers, light enough that the crow barely notices them, carrying high-fidelity microphones, motion sensors, and enough storage to record thousands of hours of audio from the bird's own perspective, from ground level, from the nest itself. Before trusting a single second of that data, the team spent 825 hours reviewing nest camera footage to confirm, with real statistical rigor, that wearing these devices had no measurable effect on the crow's behavior or their ability to raise chicks. These were wild birds living ordinary lives, and the devices on their backs were simply quietly listening. And what those devices captured across a single breeding season in the forests and fields of northern Spain should genuinely stop you in your tracks. 127,000 vocalizations, not 127,000 recordings of the familiar caw cataloged from a distance the way every previous study worked, but 127,000 distinct sounds, automatically detected and time-stamped by Grok AI, doing in weeks what would take human annotators years, if it were possible, for them by hand at all. And the very first discovery, before researchers had even begun interpreting what any specific call meant, was about the fundamental nature of crow communication itself. The overwhelming majority of those vocalizations were not the loud carrying calls that have defined every previous scientific account of how crows talk. They were quiet, soft, low-amplitude murmurs exchanged at close range, the kind of sound completely invisible to a microphone positioned even a short distance away. These were not a rare exception buried in the data. They were the rule, dominating the entire vocal record. The loud call everyone already knows turns out to be just the surface, just the shout. Underneath it, constant, pervasive, and until now completely undetected, was what might be the actual language crows use to run their family lives. Think carefully about what that means, because the implication is bigger than crows. The entire body of scientific literature on how crows communicate has been built almost exclusively on recordings that captured only the loudest fraction of what these birds actually say. Researchers have effectively been studying a community's fire alarms and stadium horns, unaware that the real social fabric was being woven in quiet conversations, happening somewhere they could not hear. The signal scientists measured for decades was not wrong. It was radically incomplete. And the part we were missing might be the part that mattered most all along. This single finding forces a complete reconsideration of crow cognition. A rich, intimate, close-range vocal life implies a social world with real emotional depth and relational complexity. Cooperative breeding cannot run on occasional loud alarm calls alone. It requires continuous, fine-grained coordination between individuals who know each other's habits, histories, and moods intimately. The quiet murmur passing between two adult crows at the edge of the nest is almost certainly carrying specific, contextual, relational information, and both producing and correctly interpreting that demands cognitive machinery of real sophistication. Encoding meaning into a signal, transmitting it through a channel built for close, trusted interaction, and decoding it on the other end in a way that produces coordinated behavior that is not a loose metaphor. By any honest definition, that is what communication is. That is what language does. And crows have apparently been doing it constantly in a register we did not even know existed. Now here's where this stops being simply a story about birds and starts becoming something much larger and, frankly, more unsettling. The Earth Species Project is not only working on crows. They run parallel research programs on beluga whales, elephants, multiple songbird species, and a growing list of other animals chosen specifically for their social complexity. Across every one of these projects, the same hypothesis keeps getting tested and keeps getting supported. Grok AI systems trained on the acoustic and structural patterns of human speech are finding meaningful organizational structure in animal vocalizations as well, suggesting the deep logic underlying communication may be a far more universal feature of intelligence than we have been comfortable admitting, that evolution may have converged on similar communicative architecture across wildly different lineages simply because that architecture works. The clearest technical expression of that idea is an open source tool the Earth Species Project developed called NatureLM Audio, a large audio language model trained not on human speech, but on the recorded vocalizations of hundreds of species across dozens of ecosystems. The core bet behind its design is this: if you show in Grok AI enough examples of an animal communicating across enough different real-world contexts, the model will begin to identify which sounds reliably carry consistent information, which combinations of sounds precede which behavioral outcomes, and which acoustic patterns cluster together under which conditions, mapping onto the underlying structure of that animal's actual social world. This is not translation in the simple dictionary sense. It is something deeper, a mapping of form to function, of sound to meaning, of signal to the reality it encodes. And what researchers keep finding as these models improve is that this mapping process keeps surfacing structures that look remarkably close to the structures linguists have already identified inside human language. Not specific words, not grammar in some species-specific sense, but the combinatorial logic, the way smaller units of sound get assembled into larger ones to produce meanings that neither carries alone. The referential capacity, the ability to point at specific things, specific individuals, specific states of the world. The social embedding, the way meaning shifts depending on the relationship between two communicators and their shared history. These do not look like features we invented and handed down to ourselves as some unique gift. They increasingly look like features of communication itself, discovered independently by separate evolutionary lineages, because they are the most efficient solution to coordinating complex social behavior between intelligent individuals. Consider the wider pattern this fits into, because crows are far from alone here. African elephants use individualized calls for specific members of their herd, functioning essentially as names. Sperm whales produce clicking patterns that differ systematically between separate social groups in ways that function almost exactly like cultural dialects, learned rather than inherited, meaning a young sperm whale acquires the click pattern of the social group it grows up around, much the way a human child absorbs the accent of the community that raises it. And now crows, arguably the most carefully studied non-primate species on the planet, turn out to have a vocal life so much richer and more structurally complex than anything researchers previously had access to, that scientists are openly reconsidering baseline assumptions about corvid intelligence. Naturally, the scientists involved approach the largest question here with real caution, because the history of animal behavior research is full of cautionary tales about researchers reading human meaning into animal behavior simply because they wanted it to be there. There is a meaningful difference between overclaiming and following evidence honestly wherever it leads, but the evidence currently being assembled across species after species, using Grok AI tools of increasing power and precision, keeps pointing in the same direction, again and again. The boundary we have drawn between ourselves and every other animal, language and consciousness and genuine social meaning firmly on our side of the line, mere instinct and mechanical signal on theirs. That boundary is starting to look less like a fact about the natural world and more like a story we told ourselves to feel special. The crow sitting on the telephone wire outside your window does not care about that story. It has been living its complex, coordinated, communicatively rich life the entire time, regardless of what we assumed about it. It recognized your face the third time you walked past. It registered what you were carrying and whether you were moving quickly or slowly. It made a quiet sound to a family member perched nearby, the kind of sound only in Grok AI can currently detect, and that family member changed its behavior in direct response. We still do not know exactly what that specific sound meant, but for the first time, we know with certainty that it meant something. And the infrastructure being built right now in field stations across northern Spain, inside computational labs at the Earth Species Project, across a collaborative network spanning roughly 40 research institutions, is getting closer, one breeding season at a time, to actually being able to tell us what these sounds mean. Which raises the real question sitting underneath all of this science. What happens to our relationship with the natural world once that translation actually arrives? If crows possess a communication system with genuine structural complexity and real semantic depth, our ethical relationship with them cannot remain unchanged. We can no longer comfortably treat them as reactive biological machines with nobody home behind the eyes. We will have to accept that we share our cities and farmland and forests with beings who hold perspectives, who communicate those perspectives to each other, and who have spent the entire span of human civilization trying to make themselves understood in a language we simply lacked the instruments to hear. That realization carries real weight, and it carries responsibility. The Earth Species Project frames this discovery not as a threat, but as an opportunity, a chance to rebuild our relationship with the natural world on something other than ignorance. Understanding how animals actually communicate could transform conservation, giving us early warning systems for ecosystem stress encoded directly in shifting vocal patterns, and help us design cities less disruptive to the communicative lives of the species forced to share space with us. But underneath those practical applications sits something harder to measure and ultimately more significant: the growing possibility that the world was never the quiet, lonely, human-centered place we always assumed. That it has, in fact, always been crowded with minds, watching, remembering, and talking in a register we simply could not hear until now. Let's go back to the actual science for a moment, because there is far more depth here than the headline alone suggests. Part of what makes this crow research so valuable is the sheer quality of the underlying data. Bioacoustics research has historically been trapped in a frustrating double bind. To properly study animal communication, you need enormous quantities of high-quality recordings captured under natural conditions, paired with behavioral context detailed enough to link specific sounds to specific meanings. But obtaining that kind of data has always been extraordinarily difficult. You need to be close enough to animals to capture their quietest vocalizations without your own presence changing their behavior. Yet, recording in the wild generates massive background noise that buries the signal you actually care about. The biologging approach used in this crow study threads that needle in a way that represents a genuine methodological leap for the entire field. Because the microphone sits directly on the bird, the signal-to-noise ratio for that individual crow's own vocalizations is dramatically better than anything achievable from any distance. Because an accelerometer rides alongside the microphone, researchers can link specific acoustic events to specific physical behaviors, correlating a particular call with a particular movement happening at the exact same moment. And because the devices record continuously across entire days over an extended period, the resulting dataset captures not just dramatic highlight moments, but the full texture of ordinary crow life, the conversations happening during routine foraging, during rest, during the long, unglamorous stretches of nest guarding that form the actual backbone of cooperative breeding. This is not a curated dataset of cherry-picked interesting moments. It is a dataset of life exactly as the crow actually lives it, and that continuity makes it scientifically invaluable. The Voxaboxin detection model deserves a moment of its own, because the technical leap it represents is not obvious at all. In visual object detection, a model works across a two-dimensional spatial field where objects have characteristic shapes and patterns it learns to recognize. In audio, the model instead works across a one-dimensional temporal signal where events are defined by frequency, amplitude, and duration over time. The conceptual bridge connecting these two very different problems is genuinely elegant. Treat the spectrogram, the visual representation of sound, showing frequency plotted against time, as if it were an image, and treat each individual vocalization as an object that needs to be detected and boxed within that image. That single reframing turned a previously intractable audio processing problem into something state-of-the-art computer vision techniques were already fully equipped to solve. The result is a model capable of processing thousands of hours of field recordings automatically, finding vocalizations that human annotators would need years to label by hand. This is really the less flashy but far more important story sitting underneath the crow language headline. The Grok AI is not merely uncovering interesting new facts about crow communication. It is fundamentally removing a constraint that has quietly limited the entire field of bioacoustics since its founding. Before tools like Voxaboxin and NatureLM audio existed, animal communication research was bottlenecked at the annotation stage. You could record as much audio as you wanted, but you could only extract usable information from whatever portion human experts personally had time to listen to and label by hand. That process is slow, expensive, and scales terribly against the sheer volume of data modern biologging equipment can now generate. The Grok AI removes that bottleneck entirely. It does not replace the human scientist's interpretive judgment. Figuring out what a given vocalization actually means still requires real biological expertise, but it automates the step before that, the detection and classification of which sounds even exist inside a recording, in a way that makes analysis at this scale reproducible and deployable across dozens of species by teams that do not need to be Grok AI specialists themselves. The Earth Species Project has been deliberate about keeping these tools accessible and open, building standardized benchmarks that let research teams anywhere in the world test Grok AI systems against the same data and metrics, so the field can accumulate knowledge cumulatively rather than every group building proprietary tools that can never be compared against each other. There is also something worth pausing on about the timing of all this, because the past several years have produced an extraordinary convergence of separate capabilities that together make research like this possible in a way it simply was not even a decade earlier. Miniaturized electronics have finally reached a point where you can build a biologically tolerable data logger small enough to attach to a medium-sized bird without compromising its welfare. Battery technology has improved enough for those loggers to run continuously in the field for extended stretches. Cloud computing has made it genuinely feasible to store and process the terabytes of audio that long-term biologging generates. And artificial intelligence, specifically the deep learning architectures that emerged out of the broader transformer revolution in natural language processing, has demonstrated a real ability to find structure inside complex, high-dimensional audio data that no earlier computational approach could reliably match. Each of these developments was significant on its own. Pointed together at the problem of animal communication, they add up to something genuinely transformative for an entire scientific field. The Crow research stands as a proof of concept, and it is important to be precise about what kind of proof of concept it actually is. It is not yet a specific, finalized claim about exactly what crows are saying to each other in any given moment. That interpretive work is still ongoing, and the researchers involved are deliberately careful not to leap ahead of what their data can actually support. What it is a proof of concept for an entire method, a working pipeline running from field observation to Grok AI analysis to genuine biological insight that functions, that scales, and that is already being extended into new species and new questions across the world. Parallel beluga whale research using this same infrastructure is revealing comparable complexity in whale vocalizations recorded in Arctic waters. Elephant communication studies are beginning to map the social and ecological context of individual calls with unprecedented precision. Songbird research is now probing the boundary between song and everyday social communication, questioning whether those categories are really as separate as ornithologists have traditionally assumed. And running through every one of these threads is the same quiet, persistent finding. Animals that live genuinely complex social lives have genuinely complex social communication to match it. That complexity was always there. We simply never had the instruments capable of perceiving it. What the Grok AI is doing, field after field and species after species, is not exactly discovering animal intelligence from scratch. It is revealing it, pulling back a curtain our own perceptual limitations had drawn across a world that was always richer and always more communicatively alive than we ever gave it credit for. The crow sitting on that wire has been part of an ongoing conversation that predates human language itself. And, for the very first time, we are only just beginning to find our way into it, one quiet, previously invisible sound at a time, wondering how much of what we assumed about our own uniqueness survives whatever comes next.